Hello, and a warm welcome to all my wonderful viewers. I am truly grateful that you have taken the time to watch and listen to my videos on this channel. Your support and presence mean so much to me, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being here. This channel was created with the aim of sharing stories, knowledge, and relaxing content that you can enjoy anytime, anywhere. Every video is made with care, passion, and a desire to bring something meaningful and enjoyable into your day, I hope you find inspiration, peace, and joy in the videos I share. Your feedback and engagement encourage me to keep creating. So please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content. Feel free to share your thoughts or suggestions in the comments. I love hearing from you and learning what you enjoy the most. I thank you for being part of this growing community. Together, we can create a space filled with positivity, learning, and entertainment. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy the journey with me. Welcome once again, and let's make this experience unforgettable. The early morning mist rolled like a living veil across the quiet fields of northern France. The air was heavy with dew, and the remnants of the night's fog clung stubbornly to the earth, softening the outlines of the land that had once been torn apart by war. Dr. Eleanor Hayes paused at the edge of the field, boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, and looked out over the expanse before her. To an untrained eye, this was just farmland, wheat swaying lazily in the cool breeze, the occasional caw of a distant crow, and the silhouette of a stone farmhouse on the horizon. But Eleanor knew better. Beneath the gentle roll of hills and the scattering of wildflowers lay the scars of battle, trenches filled in long ago, craters disguised by time, and the bones of men whose names were lost to history. Eleanor, in her late 30s, was not a woman easily swayed by sentiment. Her dark brown hair was tied back into a loose braid, and her jacket bore the smudges and stains of weeks in the field. The leather satchel hanging from her shoulder contained her tools, a set of old, folded maps, the leather satchel, folded, brushes for excavating, and a notebook filled with sketches and hastily scribbled observations. Around her neck she wore a pendant, a small brass whistle, a gift from her grandfather, who had fought in the very fields she now walked. She knelt, brushing away the damp grass with gloved hands, and laid the old maps across the ground. These maps, hand-drawn by British officers in Ichen Jubite Isht, were yellowed and fragile, their edges curling like dried leaves. She traced the faded lines that marked the positions of trenches, machine gun nests, and artillery zones. Somewhere beneath her boots lay the remains of the Western Front, the silent testimony of a war that claimed millions of lives. It was her mission to bring these forgotten stories back to light. The Western Front stretched like an open wound across Europe during the First World War, running from the Belgian coast down to Switzerland. Eleanor had studied its history for years, but standing here, on the very soil where countless soldiers had fallen, was different. The silence was over. The fields seemed almost too peaceful, as if the earth had buried the memories of gunfire, shell explosions. She began walking along the edge of the field, the satchel bouncing lightly against her side, her boots crunching softly on gravel. In her mind, she could almost see it, the soldiers huddled in muddy trenches, the clouds of mustard gas drifting ominously, a desperate sprints across no man's land. She stopped suddenly, noticing a subtle dip in the ground, a depression that was barely visible but unmistakable to someone trained to look for it. "Here," she murmured, crouching down and running her fingers over the damp soil. This was where one of the trenches had been. Sabia, long since filled in, but still faintly etched into the landscape like a ghostly memory. She pulled a small metal probe from her satchel and began to gently prod the earth. Amen. Feeling for inconsistencies, the metal tip struck something hard. Her pulse quickened. Carefully, she dug into the soil, her movements precise and deliberate. After a few minutes, she unearthed a rusted piece of metal. It was part of an old rifle barrel, caked with dirt and corrosion. The sight of it made her pause. This was not just an artifact. It was a remnant of someone's last stand, a fragment of a soldier's life. Eek! The sun was rising now, burning away the mist and casting a golden glow across the fields. As Eleanor cleaned the relic with a small brush, she thought of the soldiers who had once carried it. Who had it belonged to? A young British private, perhaps barely out of school? Or a hardened French veteran fighting to protect his homeland? These questions haunted her, not just as an archaeologist, but as a storyteller. Every object she found carried a voice, a whisper from the past. Eleanor straightened up and looked toward the farmhouse. Marcus Doyle, her research partner, was supposed to meet her here. He was a historian with a passion for military strategy, PL, and he had a knack for finding stories hidden between the lines of war diaries and reports. Together, they had spent months preparing for this expedition, combing through archives, interviewing local villagers, and studying aerial photographs from the era. Now, standing on the threshold of discovery, Eleanor felt a mixture of excitement and reverence. Yay, so... The wind picked up slightly, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. She glanced at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Time was running short for the morning's work. Kneeling once more, Eleanor carefully wrapped the rifle fragment in cloth and placed it in her satchel. As she stood, a strange feeling washed over her, as if someone was watching. She turned sharply, scanning the field. Nothing. Only the whispering grass and the distant rustle of leaves, yet she couldn't shake the sensation. She had read accounts of soldiers' ghosts lingering on these battlefields, but she had always dismissed them as superstition. Now standing here, surrounded by so much death and memory, she wasn't so sure. The first raindrops pattered against the leaves of an old chestnut tree as Eleanor made her way back toward the farmhouse. The clouds had rolled in quickly, turning the morning sky from a soft golden hue to a slate gray canvas. The distant rumble of thunder echoed faintly, mingling with the soft crunch of her boots on the gravel path. It felt as if the land itself was bracing for something. A storm, a memory, perhaps both. Marcus Doyle was already there, leaning against the weathered wooden fence. His brown trench coat, streaked with mud from the previous day's search, hung open over a blue sweater. He pushed his round glasses up the bridge of his nose and waved as she approached, his notebook tucked under one arm. "Find anything?" he asked, his British accent cutting through the soft hiss of the rain. Eleanor nodded and opened her satchel, pulling out the wrapped rifle fragment. Marcus's eyes lit up with curiosity as he carefully unwrapped it, holding it delicately as though it might crumble in his hands. "This is incredible," he whispered. "Mauser, perhaps? German issue. But the wear... Look here, near the breech. It might have been damaged during a firefight." He traced his finger over the corroded metal, his voice almost reverent. Eleanor smiled faintly. "It was buried near what I believe was a frontline trench. If we cross-reference the maps with the British attack lines, we might be able to pinpoint which regiment faced this sector." Marcus nodded, already scribbling notes in his book. That was Marcus's strength. Where Eleanor saw objects as threads of human stories, Marcus saw them as pieces of a larger tapestry of tactics, movements, and battles. They balanced each other well, a historian and an archaeologist chasing shadows of the past. By noon, the rain had turned to a steady drizzle. Eleanor and Marcus returned to the site, worse, this time with ground-penetrating radar equipment and a set of carefully marked stakes. Their goal was clear: to locate a possible collapsed trench network that ran diagonally beneath the field. While Marcus set up the equipment, Eleanor took a slow walk along the length of the suspected trench line. The depression in the earth was subtle but persistent, like a scar that refused to fade. It was during this quiet inspection that something unusual happened. As she paused near a cluster of wild poppies, she heard it, faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, a low murmur of voices, indecipherable, followed by what sounded like the clinking of metal. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The field was empty except for Marcus, who was busy adjusting the radar scanner 50 yards away. Marcus Afik, Chorthe Shusects, she called out softly, though she wasn't sure why. He looked up from the machine, puzzled. Did you hear that? She asked. Hear what? He tilted his head, listening. Nothing but the rain and the occasional bird call. Never mind, she muttered, shaking her head, though the unease lingered. Later, as the radar sweep began, the device picked up an anomaly, a long, linear shadow beneath the soil. Eleanor knelt beside the screen, tracing the shape with her finger. That's no natural formation, she said. That's our trench, Marcus grinned. I'll mark it. This could be one of the original German defensive lines, given the depth and angle. Together they set markers along the trench line, each step feeling like a small victory. As Eleanor drove one of the stakes into the ground, she felt the metal tip strike something hard. She paused, heart pounding, and carefully dug into the wet earth. Within moments, she uncovered a fragment of a helmet, heavily corroded but unmistakably German, with the faint outline of an imperial eagle barely visible on the side. She held it in her hands, the weight both physical and emotional. He must have fallen here, she whispered, almost to herself. Maybe during the bombardment of Ichen Jobite Isalop. Marcus came over and crouched beside her. We'll never know his name, but finding this means he's not completely forgotten. That's something for... As the day drew to a close, Eleanor packed the helmet and rifle fragment into protective cases. The drizzle had stopped, and a strange golden light filtered through the clouds, painting the field in hues of amber and green. The air was cool and damp, but peaceful now, deceptively peaceful. That night, Eleanor stayed in the small farmhouse loft, lying on a narrow bed with the day's discoveries running through her mind. The sound of rain against the window lulled her, but her sleep was far from restful. In the dream, she was standing in the same field, but it was no longer quiet. Gunfire cracked in the distance, shells exploded with deafening roars, and smoke filled the air. Through the haze, she saw him, a soldier in a French uniform, mud-caked and weary, his face pale but determined. He carried a rifle across his back and wore a helmet that was cracked on one side. He raised his hand and pointed toward the far edge of the field, where a trench yawned open like a scar. Eleanor woke with a start, her heart racing. The image of the soldier lingered in her mind, vivid and unsettling. She didn't believe in ghosts, or at least she hadn't. But something about this battlefield was different. The past was not silent here. It was alive, whispering through the soil and the rain. The morning air was crisp when Eleanor and Marcus set out to the site again, their boots crunching on the gravel path that led from the farmhouse to the open field. The rain from the previous day had left the earth damp and pliable, the scent of wet soil mingling with the faint perfume of wild poppies, swaying under the early sun. It was a good day for digging. The ground was soft and the sky promised fair weather. Marcus carried the ground-penetrating radar in one hand and a rolled-up tarp slung over his shoulder. Wolf. While Eleanor walked ahead with the day's excavation tools clinking softly in her satchel. She had barely slept, the dream of the French soldiers still lingering like smoke in her mind. The way he pointed toward the far edge of the field haunted her. It felt less like a dream and more like a warning, or perhaps a plea. "This is it," Marcus said, breaking the silence. He planted the radar unit into the ground and flicked it on, its small screen coming to life with colorful lines and shadows. "We'll grid out the area we marked yesterday. If our luck holds, we'll find something deeper today." Eleanor nodded, adjusting the strap on her satchel. "I can almost feel it," she murmured. "These trenches are like veins running beneath the soil. It's strange. They're invisible to everyone else. But once you've studied the maps, it's as though they call to you." Marcus gave her a curious look, but said nothing. He had long since learned to trust Eleanor's instincts. She had an uncanny ability to sense where to dig, as though the land itself whispered to her, knew. By mid-morning, they had outlined a section of ground about 20 meters long. "It's the Morchtenses." Eleanor knelt at one corner, brushing away the surface soil with a trowel. Each scrape of the metal against earth felt like peeling back the pages of time. Soon, the first hint of the trench's wooden lining emerged, a rotted timber beam, half swallowed by mud. "Marcus, over here," she called. He hurried over, notebook in hand, crouching beside her. "Look at this, the trench wall." "We're right on top of it," Marcus whistled softly. "It's been nearly a century, and yet it's still here, like a skeleton just under the surface. Incredible." Eleanor carefully cleared more soil, exposing a few sandbags, fused into the earth, their fabric hardened like stone. Beside them lay a rusted shovel, its handle broken. It was not a relic from a museum. This was a tool that had been used in desperation, by hands that had trembled and bled. As the trench outline grew clearer, Marcus began documenting it meticulously, sketching its shape and measuring its depth. "This could be part of the German defensive line during the Somme offensive," he said. "Judging by its angle and construction, it might date to mid-1800 Luke." Eleanor nodded absently, her mind already wandering to the stories buried here. She imagined the soldiers crouching in this very trench, rain dripping from their helmets, the stench of mud and fear filling their lungs. How many of them had survived? How many had never left this patch of earth? In the early afternoon, they uncovered something unexpected. Eleanor's trowel scraped against metal, and this time it was not a weapon or helmet. It was a small, dented tin box. She lifted it carefully from the soil, brushing away the mud to reveal faint markings on the lid. "What is it?" Marcus asked, peering over her shoulder. "A soldier's personal tin," Eleanor said softly. "Could be tobacco or letters." She opened it slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside were a few crumpled photographs, faded beyond recognition, and what appeared to be a silver locket, tarnished but intact. Eleanor's breath caught as she opened the locket, revealing a tiny portrait of a young woman with kind eyes and a soft smile. "Someone carried this with them until the end," Eleanor whispered. The intimacy of the object struck her deeply. This wasn't just history, it was love, frozen in time. Marcus knelt beside her, silent for a moment. "We'll catalog it, clean it properly, but I think you're right. This might have belonged to a soldier who never made it out of here. Later, as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the field in shades of gold and crimson. They took a break on the edge of the trench. Marcus jotted down notes while Eleanor stared into the distance, absently running her thumb over the locket. "This place," she said finally, "it's not just about battles or strategies. It's about people, their lives, their fears, their loves. Every artifact we find is a voice. We can't let them fade." Marcus looked at her with a rare softness in his eyes. "You have a gift for seeing them, Eleanor. Maybe that's why they're drawn to you." Eleanor didn't reply. The words sent a chill through her, bringing back the memory of the soldier from her dream. She hadn't told Marcus about it, not yet, but as she glanced toward the far edge of the field, where the poppies swayed gently in the wind, she could almost see a figure standing there, watching. That night, after logging their findings, Eleanor stood outside the farmhouse under a starry sky. The fields were silent, but she felt the weight of history pressing around her. She held the silver locket tightly in her palm, as though it were a lifeline. Somewhere, buried deep in the earth, the past was still alive, and it was calling her deeper into its shadows. The village lay just beyond a line of poplar trees, its weathered stone cottages huddled together as if for warmth against the centuries. Eleanor and Marcus walked along the cobbled path leading into the heart of the settlement, Tlek! Their boots echoing softly against the uneven stones. Here, time seemed to have slowed. Ivy crept across walls. Wooden shutters bore scars of age, and the bell tower of a small church tilted slightly under its own weight. The village felt almost untouched by modernity, as though it were content to remain a quiet witness to history. Marcus adjusted his glasses, glancing at the notes in his hand. If the stories we've heard are true, some of the locals might remember the last whispers of the Western Front. There's an old woman here, Marie Lefebvre, who apparently knows where some soldiers are buried. She was just a girl during the Second World War, but her parents, they lived through the Great War. Eleanor nodded, taking in the details around her. It wasn't just the buildings. The entire village carried the weight of memory. Even the air felt heavy, rich, with stories waiting to be told. If anyone can point us in the right direction, it's her. They found Marie Lefebvre sitting on a wooden bench outside a small house, its roof sagging slightly under the weight of age. She was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a neat bun, her face a map of wrinkles etched by time and experience. She wore a faded blue dress and a wool shawl draped over her shoulders, and her hands rested on a wooden cane. When Eleanor introduced herself, Marie's eyes lit with curiosity and recognition. "Ah, you are the ones looking for the old battlefields," she said, her voice carrying the soft lilt of rural France. "My father used to say the land never forgets, even if men do." Marcus knelt slightly to meet her gaze. "We're trying to uncover the old trenches, Madame Lefebvre. We found some artifacts, but we believe there's more hidden here, near the outskirts of the village." Marie looked out across the fields, her eyes narrowing, as if she could still see the ghosts of soldiers marching across them. "Yes, they are there. My father told me of the night the sky burned red. The shells fell like rain, and the ground shook. Many soldiers never made it back. They were buried where they fell." Eleanor leaned in, sensing that Marie's memories were as valuable as any artifact they could find. "Do you know where exactly? Could you show us?" The old woman nodded slowly, tapping her cane against the cobbles. "Just beyond the orchard, near the river bank, there is a line of poppies that grow there every year, even when none grow elsewhere. My mother used to say they are fed by the blood of the fallen. I can take you there." Eleanor and Marcus exchanged a glance. the kind of silent agreement that passed easily between them after months of collaboration. They followed Marie as she led them through narrow lanes and out toward the orchard. Despite her age, she moved with surprising determination. Her cane striking the path with rhythmic precision, the orchard was quiet. The gnarled branches of old apple trees stretching against the pale sky. Beyond it, just as Marie had said, was a field where wild poppies bloomed in a line, as if marking a forgotten boundary. The flowers swayed gently in the breeze, their vivid red petals stark against the muted greens and browns of the landscape. "This is the place," Marie whispered, her voice almost reverent. "Many years ago, my father and his neighbors buried soldiers here, French and German alike. They had no time for names or ceremonies. Just earth and silence." Eleanor felt a chill crawl up her spine. She crouched down, running her fingers through the grass. The soil here was different, softer, looser. "Marcus, this could be an unmarked grave site," she said quietly. "We need to document this." Marcus nodded, already sketching the area in his notebook. He looked up at Marie. "Do you remember anything else about that time?" Marie's gaze grew distant. "I remember the night they brought the bodies. I was very young, but I heard the cries, the murmurs of prayers. The war did not end when the guns went silent. The dead stayed here, waiting." Eleanor pulled out her camera and began photographing the area while Marcus placed small markers around the perimeter. It was a sacred space, and they worked with a deep sense of respect. Each poppy felt like a sentinel, guarding the memories of those who had fallen. As the sun dipped lower, Marie sat beneath one of the old apple trees, watching them with quiet approval. "You do good work," she said softly. "The land will thank you for remembering." Eleanor smiled at her. "Thank you for guiding us. Without your memories, we wouldn't have found this place." Marie's expression softened. "Remember this, the land does not speak to everyone, but for those who listen, it tells the truth." Later, as they escorted Marie back to the village, Eleanor felt the weight of the day settle on her. The discovery was significant, but more than that, it was emotional. These weren't just nameless sites on a map. They were resting places for men who had once laughed, written letters, and dreamed of home. Back at the farmhouse, Marcus carefully catalogued the photos and notes from the orchard site. "We'll need to come back tomorrow with the scanner," he said, his voice thoughtful. "This could be one of the largest unmarked sites we've found yet." Eleanor nodded, staring at the locket they had uncovered the day before. Somehow, she felt it belonged to one of these men. "We owe them a story," she murmured. "Every single one." The next morning, the landscape of Verdun stretched out before them like a vast, open graveyard. Eleanor and Marcus drove through winding roads, the mist clinging to the trees and valleys. Verdun was not just a battlefield. It was a place where history had soaked into every inch of soil, where the air itself seemed heavy with memory. Even the forests here were stretched. The trees grew twisted, their roots entangled with shrapnel and bone fragments buried long ago. Marcus was quiet as he drove, his fingers drumming lightly on the steering wheel. "They called Verdun the furnace," he said at last, breaking the silence. 300 days of fighting, over 700,000 casualties. It's hard to imagine that kind of devastation. Eleanor, staring out of the window, nodded solemnly. "It's not just the numbers, it's the silence that's left behind. You can feel it." They parked near a clearing where the land was pockmarked with craters, remnants of relentless shelling that had scarred the earth a century ago. The grass had grown back, but the ground remained uneven, each depression like a frozen memory of violence. Eleanor shouldered her satchel while Marcus carried the ground-penetrating radar and his notebook. "This is the sector," Marcus said. consulting a map from the French military archives. The Census-Teeth Infantry Regiment fought here. Some of the fiercest trench-to-trench battles were along this ridge. Eleanor crouched, brushing her fingertips along the grass. The soil here was different, darker, richer. "We're walking on layers of history," she murmured. Somewhere under this ground, lives ended in an instant as they began their survey. The air grew strangely still. There was no wind, no birdsong, only the sound of their own footsteps and the faint hum of the radar. Eleanor walked ahead, her senses alert, scanning the uneven ground. It was then that she saw something partially buried in the dirt, a glint of metal dulled by age. She knelt and carefully unearthed it. It was a dog tag, tarnished but still legible. The letters were faint but recognizable. Lieutenant Thomas Gallagher, Royal Irish Regiment. Eleanor froze, reading the name aloud. Marcus stepped closer, his brows furrowed. Royal Irish. He must have fought here during the later offensives. That's a remarkable find. She held the tag in her palm, feeling its weight. For a moment, it felt as though the air thickened, the mist rolling in, heavier around them. A distant sound, like boots marching on gravel, seemed to echo faintly in the distance. She stood, scanning the tree line. "Nothing, did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. Marcus shook his head. "Hear what?" Eleanor hesitated, gripping the dog tag tighter. "It's nothing. Probably just my imagination." They continued their work, but Eleanor's unease grew. Each crater seemed to whisper as they passed, as if voices were trapped in the earth. When the sun dipped behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the clearing, she felt a sudden chill. She turned, and there he was. A man stood at the far end of the clearing, his uniform mud-stained and torn. He wore a British officer's tunic, the insignia barely visible beneath grime. His face was pale, almost luminous against the gray backdrop, and his eyes, sorrowful yet determined, were fixed on her. "Marcus," Eleanor whispered. But when she turned to him and then looked back, the man was gone. The clearing was that night, back at their temporary lodging near Verdun. Eleanor couldn't shake the image. She sat at the wooden desk, the dog tag lying beside her notebook. Marcus noticed her distraction. "You've been quiet since we got back," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "Something wrong?" Eleanor hesitated, then decided to tell him. "I saw someone today, a soldier. He was standing there, watching us." Marcus frowned. "A local? Maybe another researcher?" She shook her head. "No, Marcus, he wasn't alive. At least, not in the way we are." For a long moment, he said nothing, just studying her face. Finally, he sighed. "You've been having dreams about soldiers since we started this project. Maybe it's your mind playing tricks." "Maybe," Eleanor said softly. But in her heart, she knew it wasn't just her mind. Something about Verdun stirred the spirits of the past. The presence she felt wasn't imagination. It was memory made real. The next day, they returned to the clearing, determined to finish their survey. Marcus busied himself with the radar equipment, while Eleanor wandered toward the spot where she'd seen the soldier. The mist was thick again, curling around her boots. She closed her eyes, listening. For a moment, she could almost hear voices, orders shouted, men calling out to each other, the pounding of artillery. She opened her eyes, and there, just beyond the mist, stood Lieutenant Thomas Gallagher. He looked exactly as he had the day before, but this time, he raised his hand and pointed toward the woods at the edge of the clearing. Eleanor's breath caught. Was he guiding her? She took a cautious step forward, but the vision faded, dissolving into mist. The morning mist clung to the battlefield like a shroud. as Eleanor and Marcus returned to the clearing near Verdun. The ground, wet from last night's rain, squelched beneath their boots, and the acrid scent of damp earth filled the air. Eleanor carried her satchel, its weight heavier than usual, not because of the tools inside, but because of the dog tag of Lieutenant Thomas Gallagher. It was as though that small piece of metal carried the presence of its owner, urging her onward. Marcus, slightly ahead, adjusted his glasses and glanced at the map. "We're close to the point Gallagher's regiment would have dug in," he said. "There was a major artillery strike here during the Battle of Verdun. If we're right, we may find some of the battlefield's original debris still intact." Eleanor remained silent, scanning the uneven terrain. Her mind was restless, replaying the image of the ghostly soldier she had seen. Every step she took felt deliberate, as if she were following invisible footprints left by those who had fallen more than a century ago. They began their survey near a shallow depression that looked like the remnants of a trench. Eleanor crouched, running her fingers across the damp soil, which was dark and thick like clay. Pulling a small trowel from her bag, she started to dig with slow, precise strokes. After only a few minutes, her tool scraped against metal. "Marcus," she called softly. "There's something here." He hurried over, kneeling beside her. "Careful," he murmured, watching as she cleared away the mud. Soon, a rusted bayonet emerged from the earth, its blade bent and dulled by time. It was caked with dark stains, not just rust but something else, something that made Eleanor's stomach tighten. "Is that blood?" Marcus asked, his voice hushed. "Could be," Eleanor said, her tone low and reverent. "After all this time, traces can remain." This was more than a weapon. It was part of someone's final moments. They continued excavating, working as a team. Within the hour, they had uncovered a soldier's helmet, its surface dented from shrapnel. Inside was a ragged piece of fabric, stiff and dark, a fragment of what might have been a blood-soaked uniform. Eleanor carefully placed the items on a tarp, each artifact treated as if it were sacred. "This is incredible," Marcus whispered, jotting down notes. "Every item here tells a story. You can almost see the battle unfolding, the trench collapsing under shell fire, the men fighting hand to hand, the chaos." Eleanor nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She stared at the bayonet, its blade stained with history, and felt an odd chill. It was as though the air around them thickened, the silence pressing in. Then she heard it, a faint clinking like metal tapping against stone. She froze, her breath catching. "Marcus, do you hear that?" He paused, listening. The sound was faint but real, echoing, as if from far away. It grew louder, the metallic rhythm blending with something else, the low, distant murmur of voices. "It's the wind," Marcus said uncertainly, though his expression betrayed his own unease. Eleanor shook her head. "No, it's something else." She stood and scanned the clearing. Her gaze fell upon a patch of earth near the tree line, where the soil seemed recently disturbed. "There," she said, pointing. "Something's calling us over there." Marcus followed her reluctantly. They began digging at the spot, and within minutes, Eleanor's trowel struck something hard. She cleared away the dirt to reveal a rusted metal box, its edges corroded, but still intact. With trembling hands, she pried it open. Inside was a collection of personal belongings, a fountain pen, a pocket watch, stopped at Shu, Chi, and a folded letter, sealed but water-damaged. Eleanor carefully removed the letter, her breath quickening. The faded handwriting was still visible. "Shouldn't, sir. To my dearest Anna. If you are reading this, I may not have made it home. Tell our little one I loved her until my last breath." The ink blurred into smudges, but the sentiment was unmistakable. Eleanor swallowed hard, her throat tight. Marcus! This man never left this field. His story is still here. Suddenly, a sharp breeze swept through the clearing, rustling the trees and sending the tarp fluttering. Eleanor turned, her heart pounding, and there he was again. Lieutenant! Thomas Gallagher stood at the edge of the clearing, his pale face half hidden beneath his helmet, his eyes fixed on her. This time his presence was undeniable, solid and clear against the mist. "Do you see him?" she whispered urgently. Marcus looked up, following her gaze. But there was nothing there. "See who?" "Gallagher," she said, her voice trembling. "He's pointing over there." She gestured to a section of ground just beyond their excavation site. Marcus frowned but didn't argue. "All right, let's check it out." They moved to the indicated spot and began digging again. The soil here was darker, almost black. Eleanor's trowel hit something solid, wood. They cleared away the dirt to reveal a rotted wooden crate. Inside were more relics, a rusted trench knife, a set of dog tags, and a torn regimental badge. Among them lay a blood-stained field dressing, still rolled tightly. "This must have been part of a first aid kit," Marcus said, examining the badge. "Royal Irish Regiment again. Gallagher's men." Eleanor's hands shook as she placed the items on the tarp. "He wants us to remember them," she murmured. "Not just him. All of them." By late afternoon, the light was fading. They packed the artifacts with care, storing them in protective cases. Eleanor lingered for a moment, staring at the spot where she had seen Gallagher. "I don't know why I can see him," she said softly, "but I think he's leading us somewhere. Maybe to the place where they all fell." Marcus, though skeptical, didn't dismiss her words. "Retracing. Whatever's guiding you, it's helping us find things we never would have found otherwise. Let's keep following it." As they walked back toward the vehicle, Eleanor glanced over her shoulder. For just a moment, she thought she saw Gallagher standing there, watching them leave, his figure fading into the mist like a shadow. Foring, the farmhouse kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee and damp earth as Eleanor and Marcus prepared for another long day on the Verdun site. Sunlight streamed through the casting warm patches on the rough wooden table where their findings from the previous day lay carefully arranged. The rusted bayonet, the dented helmet, the pocket watch, and the fragile letter to Anna. Each item felt like a relic of grief and love, a whisper from the past. Eleanor traced her finger lightly over the letter, now safely pressed between layers of archival paper. "He wrote this knowing he might never see his family again," she said softly. "It's almost unbearable to read, like holding someone's final thoughts." Marcus, pouring himself a cup of coffee, nodded solemnly. "It's powerful, yes, but it's also why we're here, to find these voices again." He tapped his notebook, filled with sketches and transcriptions. "Today, I want to focus on that sector beyond the tree line. If Gallagher's men were there, their personal effects might have survived underground." Eleanor met his gaze. "I agree. But Marcus, I need to tell you something." He raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "I keep seeing him, Gallagher, not just in my dreams anymore. Yesterday, he pointed us toward that crate. It's like he wants me to follow him." Marcus set his mug down, clearly unsettled, but trying to remain logical. "You think the ghost of a soldier is guiding you?" "Eleanor, I don't think I feel it," she interrupted, her tone firm. "Whether it's real or not, it's leading us to something. We can't ignore that." Marcus sighed, but didn't argue. "All right, let's follow your instincts." The site was quiet when they arrived, the mist curling like smoke around the cratered landscape. Eleanor felt a strange heaviness in her chest as she walked. past the area where they had unearthed the blood-stained relics. Today, they aimed to explore the ground just beyond the tree line, the place Gallagher's ghost had pointed toward. The soil here was soft but uneven, and Marcus quickly set up the ground-penetrating radar. "There's something large beneath here," he called out, studying the screen. "Looks like a collapsed dugout or shelter. Possibly untouched." Eno knelt, her trowel in hand, and began to clear the topsoil. Within an hour, they had uncovered the edge of wooden beams, the rotting remains of what must have been a reinforced shelter. With careful precision, they widened the hole until they could reach inside. Her hand brushed against something smooth and rectangular. She pulled it free, a leather-bound notebook, its cover stiff and darkened by years underground. "A diary," Eleanor breathed. It survived. They carefully extracted several more notebooks, each bound with cracked leather and wrapped with rusted metal clasps. Inside, the ink had bled in some places, but many of the words were still legible. Marcus's hands trembled slightly as he opened one and began to read aloud. "Ferdial, November 17, 1916. The rain has not stopped. We sleep in mud, we eat in mud, we are mud." The men whisper of home, of sweet bread and warm beds. "I wonder if I will ever see Ireland again." Eleanor's throat tightened as she listened. These weren't just historical entries. They were confessions, raw and unfiltered. Lives poured onto the page, preserved for over a century. "We have to document every word," Marcus said, his voice hushed with reverence. "This is history speaking directly to us." As they worked, the atmosphere around them seemed to grow heavier, as if the very air carried the weight of these stories. The wind picked up, swirling through the trees with a low, mournful sound. Eleanor paused, the hair on the back of her neck rising. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Marcus glanced up. "The wind? No, it's voices." She closed her eyes, and for a moment, she was no longer standing in a quiet clearing. She was there, in each Enjolbaiti chaloupe, hearing the murmured prayers of soldiers, the cries of the wounded, the frantic scribbling of pens on paper. She opened her eyes abruptly. Gallagher stood a few feet away, his spectral form pale against the dark woods. He was staring at her, his expression solemn, almost pleading. Slowly, he raised his hand and pointed again, this time toward the remains of a shattered tree near the edge of the shelter. Episeph. With trembling hands, Eleanor dug near the tree's roots. Her trowel hit something metallic. Clearing the dirt, she uncovered a small tin box. Inside were a series of folded letters tied with string, each one addressed to families back home. Some were marked "Return to Sender, Never Delivered." Eleanor's eyes welled with tears as she read the first line of one letter. Trindle. "Dear Mother, if this reaches you, know that I fought bravely and thought of you until the very end." Daft. She swallowed hard and looked up. But Gallagher was gone. By late afternoon, they had unearthed several diaries and dozens of letters. Marcus carefully catalogued each one, his excitement tempered by the emotional gravity of their discoveries. "These aren't just artifacts," he said. "They're voices that were silenced. Reading these feels like stepping into their final moments." Eleanor nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Gallagher's trying to tell us something. I think these diaries are just the beginning. There's more, something bigger, that we have to find." That evening, back at the farmhouse, Eleanor spent hours reading by lantern light. One diary entry in particular struck her. "Sergeant Lieutenant Gallagher says, 'We hold this line or die trying.' I believe him. He's not afraid of death, but I see the weight in his eyes. He carries all of us on his shoulders." Eleanor closed the diary, her chest tight. She felt a deep connection to Gallagher now, not just as a ghostly figure, but as a man who had led others through unimaginable horror. She knew he was guiding her for a reason. The following day, the mist hung heavy over the fields, a pale shroud that blurred the horizon. Eleanor and Marcus left the farmhouse at dawn, their gear packed and their minds set on exploring the sector that lay just beyond the Verdun clearing. This area, marked by scattered iron fragments and rusted barbed wire, had once been part of the German front line. It was here, according to records, that the Royal Irish Regiment had clashed with German forces commanded by a stubborn and relentless sergeant named Wilhelm Bauer. Marcus had mentioned Bauer's name during breakfast, reading from one of the diaries they had recovered. Bauer was infamous for holding his ground, he said, flipping through his notes. Even when the British shells rained down, he refused to retreat. One soldier wrote that they could hear him shouting orders in the middle of the chaos. He pulled, his voice carrying over the artillery like iron against fire. Eleanor tucked a strand of hair under her cap as she listened. If Bauer died here, he deserves to be remembered too. It wasn't just one side. All of them suffered, all of them bled into this soil. Marcus nodded, his eyes somber. Then today, we find his story. The ground was littered with fragments of history, twisted metal, shell casings, and shards of rusted helmets. Eleanor crouched near a depression in the earth, her gloved hands sifting through the damp soil. Almost immediately, her fingers closed around something hard. She pulled it free, revealing a German belt buckle adorned with the faded crest of the imperial eagle. "Marcus, look at this," she called. He hurried over, his eyes widening. "This is incredible," he murmured, brushing dirt from the metal. "Standard issue for German infantry. Could have belonged to Bauer, or one of his men." They marked the site and continued their search. Not far from the buckle, Eleanor's trowel struck something larger. She dug with precision, uncovering a Stahlhelm, the iconic German steel helmet, its surface pitted and scarred by shrapnel. A jagged hole near the crown told a grim story. Eleanor held it in her hands, the weight of it pressing down on her heart. Who wore this? Did he survive that blast? Or is he still here, waiting for someone to remember? The atmosphere grew tense as they delved deeper into the site. Marcus set up the radar unit, scanning the ground for anomalies. The screen flickered with shapes, long, thin shadows that suggested collapsed bunkers and buried crates. "Free 40. We've got something here," he said. "About 2 meters down. Could be a weapons cache or personal effects." Elena began digging carefully, the earth yielding reluctantly to her trowel and spade. After an hour of labor, the corner of a wooden box emerged from the soil. Its iron fittings were rusted and fragile, but the box itself was surprisingly intact. With great care, they pried it open. Inside lay a collection of German artifacts, a trench dagger with a leather sheath, a pair of cracked binoculars, a pocket compass, and a small leather journal. Eleanor picked up the journal, its cover stiff with age, and opened it. The first page was written in elegant, slanted German script. "It's Bauer's journal," Marcus confirmed, translating quickly. "Listen to this. We are surrounded. I will not abandon my men. If this is my end, let it be known I stood firm under the iron sky." Soon, Eleanor felt a chill run through her. The words radiated defiance, but also a profound sadness. "He knew he wouldn't survive," she whispered, as they catalogued the contents of the box. A sudden gust of wind whipped through the clearing, rattling the nearby. Eleanor looked up, her heart skipping a beat. At the far edge of the crater, a figure stood, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a ghostly version of the German uniform. His face was gaunt, his eyes like dark coals burning with unspoken memories. "Marcus," Eleanor said sharply. "Do you see him?" Marcus followed her gaze, but again he saw nothing. "Eleanor, there's no one." "There is," she interrupted, her voice firm. "Wilhelm Bauer. He's here." The spectral figure raised a hand, almost as if in salute, before turning slowly and pointing toward a patch of earth near the tree line. Eleanor knew instantly what he meant. Without hesitation, she walked to the spot and began digging. Beneath the surface, she found another relic, a rusted rifle, its barrel bent from an explosion, and beneath it, a set of dog tags. The letters were barely visible, but she could still read them. Bauer, Wilhelm. Eleanor's breath caught. "It's him. Marcus, this is his resting place." Marcus stared at the tags, his skepticism melting into awe. I don't know how you're finding these things, but I can't explain it." Eleanor looked toward the spot where Bauer had stood. The ghostly figure was gone, but the air still felt charged, as though he had left a part of himself behind. As dusk fell, they packed their findings: Bauer's journal, his dog tags, and the artifacts from the cache. Sitting on the back of the truck, Eleanor flipped through the journal again. The final entry was dated just days before the regiment's annihilation. "If the iron sky falls upon me, so be it. But I will not be forgotten. Not if these words survive." Eleanor closed the journal with a heavy heart. "You won't be forgotten," she whispered, as if Bauer could hear her. The entrance to the collapsed bunker was almost invisible, obscured by decades of soil, moss, and creeping roots. Eleanor crouched low, her gloved hands clearing away the debris until the shape of the wooden doorway revealed itself. The rotting beams creaked under the pressure of time, as though groaning at the thought of being disturbed. The air that drifted from the dark opening carried a damp, metallic scent, one Eleanor recognized immediately as rust, decay, and the long-silenced residue of war. Marcus knelt beside her, peering into the black void. "This must have been a forward supply bunker," he said, studying his notes. "The map I found last night shows a structure right under this ridge. If we're lucky, it hasn't collapsed completely." Eleanor tightened her satchel straps and looked at him. "Lucky isn't the word I'd use," she said grimly. "Places like this, they're like time capsules. Whatever's inside hasn't seen light since the war ended." Marcus adjusted his glasses and gave a nervous chuckle. "That's exactly why we're here. Shall we?" They donned protective gloves and headlamps, and for the first time on this expedition, both wore modern respirators. Eleanor insisted on it. The risk of chemical residues, particularly from mustard gas, was too great. The sight of them, dressed like ghostly versions of the soldiers who once fought here, was unsettling even to Marcus. Anna stepped into the bunker first, the beam from her headlamp cutting through the darkness. The wooden stairs creaked dangerously under her boots, threatening to give way. "Careful," she called back. "The structure's unstable." Marcus followed, his respirator fogging slightly as he breathed. The tunnel was narrow, forcing them to move single file. Rusted metal lined the walls, and long-decayed wooden supports gave off a sour, moldy odor. With each step deeper underground, the world above seemed to vanish. Replaced by the suffocating silence of the bunker, they reached a small chamber at the end of the tunnel. Eleanor's beam swept across the room, illuminating a haunting tableau of relics frozen in time. Gasmasks fläst crossed their cracked glass eyes staring upward like the hollow gaze of long-dead soldiers. A few helmets, caved in from blast impacts, sat among broken rifles and canisters. The faded stencil on one of the canisters made Eleanor's stomach knot. GS. GS. Mustard gas shells, Marcus muttered, his voice muffled by the respirator. This place must have been used to store them. When the bunker collapsed, the soldiers down here... He didn't finish the sentence. Eleanor crouched beside one of the gas masks, brushing dirt from its rubber surface. These men didn't stand a chance, she said softly. Once the gas filled the air, it burned the lungs, the eyes. They suffocated in darkness. Marcus swallowed hard. This is worse than any battlefield we've seen so far. It's like the earth is still holding on to their suffering. In a corner of the chamber, Eleanor noticed something half buried in the soil. She dug gently, uncovering a wooden crate, its lid splintered, but still mostly intact. Inside were more gas masks, but one caught her eye. It was smaller, clearly meant for a young soldier or perhaps a messenger boy. She held it up, her hands trembling slightly. "Look at this," she whispered. "Someone this young had to fight and die?" In a place like this, Marcus stared, his face pale behind the respirator. "We need to document everything. Photos, sketches. The world needs to see this." While Marcus took photographs, Eleanor moved toward another corner, where the beam of her headlamp revealed the outline of something metallic beneath a thin layer of earth. It was a canister, dented and corroded. She lifted it carefully, expecting it to be empty, but the faint rattle of contents inside made her freeze. "Marcus," she said sharply, "this one's still sealed." His head jerked toward her. "Careful! If it's live..." He moved quickly to her side, examining the canister. "We need to call in experts for this. We can't risk moving it any further." Eleanor nodded, lowering it gently back into its resting place. Even after a century, the poison trapped inside could still kill. The thought sent a chill through her. Keo, as they prepared to leave, Eleanor felt the familiar sensation of being watched. She turned, and through the dim haze of dust and shadows, she saw him again. Lieutenant Thomas Gallagher. He stood at the far end of the chamber, his spectral figure bathed in a pale, eerie glow. His gas mask dangled from one hand, and his expression was grim, as though remembering the horror of the day the bunker became a death trap. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Marcus!" she whispered. "He's here!" Marcus looked around but saw nothing. "Eleanor, don't..." But Gallagher moved. He raised his arm slowly, pointing toward the deepest part of the bunker wall. Eleanor felt compelled to follow his gesture. She knelt near the wall and began brushing away loose dirt. Moments later, she uncovered a metal tin, heavily rusted but still sealed. "What is it?" Marcus asked, crouching beside her. Eleanor pried the tin open with her trowel, revealing the contents: a small notebook and a collection of letters wrapped in oilcloth. She pulled the notebook out and opened it, revealing neat handwriting on the first page. "Brandel, we are trapped. The gas is coming through the vents. I can't see. I can't breathe. If anyone finds this, tell my family I died thinking of home." The words blurred before Eleanor's eyes as emotion washed over her. She closed the notebook and held it to her chest. "This is their last testament," she whispered. Their final words. Marcus, for once, had no reply. He simply nodded, his expression heavy with the weight of what they had uncovered. When they finally emerged from the bunker, the late afternoon sun felt almost blinding. Eleanor sat on the grass, pulling off her respirator and breathing deeply of the cool air. "That bunker is a tomb," she said quietly. "But it's also a story waiting to be told." Marcus sat beside her, wiping dirt from his hands. "A story that's going to haunt me for the rest of my life," he admitted. Eleanor looked out across the field, the ghost of Gallagher still vivid in her mind. "He's showing us the way. We have to keep going." The following day, Eleanor and Marcus stood on the edge of a field that once bore a name etched in horror, no man's land. Here, a century ago, death had ruled without mercy. The earth itself still carried the scars of war. Shallow depressions where craters had been, rusted coils of barbed wire snaking through the grass, and the faint glint of forgotten shell fragments beneath the soil. Eleanor tightened her coat against the wind that swept across the open field. Unlike the confined bunkers or trenches, this place felt overwhelmingly exposed. "This is where they charged," she murmured, staring out over the ground that stretched toward the distant line of trees. Hundreds of men, running headlong into gunfire and artillery. Marcus adjusted his glasses, scanning the landscape with a mixture of curiosity and unease. According to the reports, Captain Edward Harris and his battalion disappeared somewhere here during an attack in the summer of Ichenjulbite Ishiti. There's no record of them returning. It's as if the earth swallowed them whole. Eleanor's gaze lingered on the horizon, where the sky met the field in a thin, gray line. "Then we'll find them," she said, her voice resolute. "They deserve to be remembered." They began their survey at the center of the field, using the ground-penetrating radar to scan for anomalies. The machine's soft hum filled the silence, interrupted only by the occasional chirp of birds or the rustle of grass underfoot. Marcus called out from behind the monitor, "We're getting some irregular signals here. Metallic objects, maybe even wooden structures about a meter down." Eleanor knelt, her fingers brushing over a patch of earth that felt softer than the surrounding soil. She dug gently with her trowel, soon uncovering a fragment of barbed wire, its rusted spikes still sharp after all these years. As she carefully removed it, her hand struck something else, smooth and metallic. She pulled it free, revealing the battered remains of a British officer's whistle. Marcus knelt beside her, his brow furrowed. That could have belonged to Harris. Officers used whistles to signal charges across no man's land. Eleanor turned the whistle over in her hands, feeling the weight of its history. He might have blown this in his final moments, leading his men into fire. She whispered. They expanded their dig, uncovering more remnants, the twisted frame of a Lee Enfield rifle, the buckle of a soldier's webbing belt, and, most hauntingly, a tattered scrap of uniform fabric. The fabric was soaked with the dark stains of time, and when Eleanor brushed it clean, she found the faded insignia of the Royal Irish Regiment, Harris's battalion. Marcus read aloud from one of the diaries they had brought with them. "Priel, Captain. Harris led us across the open ground. I remember his voice shouting for us to keep moving. Even as shells exploded around us, we ran through fire and smoke, and I thought I'd see home again. But I never did." The words, written over a century ago, seemed to echo in the wind, carried across the desolate field like the voices of the dead. By midday, they had located what appeared to be a shallow trench, collapsed long ago. The radar indicated objects beneath it. Eleanor and Marcus worked in silence, their hands muddy and numb, until Eleanor uncovered a metal container. When she opened it, her breath caught. Inside were several water-damaged notebooks and letters, the personal writings of Captain Harris himself. She opened the first page, the ink faded but still legible periendo. "If we don't return from this advance, let it be known that my men were brave. And we walked through hell for a cause we believed in. I can only hope someone will one day tell our story." Eleanor's chest tightened as she read, her fingers trembling slightly. "He knew," she said softly. "He knew they weren't coming back." Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his face pale. This is extraordinary." "We found Harris's words," We found him. The sky darkened as afternoon waned, clouds gathering overhead like a slow-moving storm. The wind picked up, and with it came a strange sound. Faint at first, but growing clearer. Eleanor froze, listening. It was the sound of boots striking the ground, of men running. She turned and saw them. A spectral battalion advanced across the field, their figures shimmering like heat waves. At their head was Captain Edward Harris, a tall man with sharp features and a whistle clenched between his lips. His uniform was torn, his face smeared with mud and blood, but his eyes burned with fierce determination. He lifted his arm, signaling his men forward. "Marcus," Eleanor whispered. "Do you see them?" Marcus turned, but the field was empty to him. "See what?" "They're here," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Harris and his men. They're showing us where they fell." She followed the line of their spectral march, stopping where the figures seemed to vanish into the earth. "This is where they died," she murmured. "This is where we need to dig." They marked the site and began excavating, unearthing a grim collection of artifacts, shattered rifles, spent cartridges, and the remnants of soldiers' packs. Eleanor found a battered officer's cap, its badge still barely visible. Inside the lining was a name tag, Harris, E. She held it up to Marcus, her voice breaking. "It's him." Marcus swallowed hard, his skepticism now replaced by quiet reverence. "Then we'll make sure his story is told." As the sun set, they packed the recovered items, Harris's whistle, his cap, and the letters, into protective cases. Eleanor lingered at the edge of the field, her eyes scanning the horizon. For a moment, she saw Harris standing there, his figure glowing faintly in the twilight. He raised the whistle to his lips, gave a silent nod, and then faded into the dusk. The next morning, Eleanor and Marcus returned to the edge of no man's land, Brakukments, Themtin Sing Den, where the spectral echoes of Captain Harris's battalion still lingered in Eleanor's mind. The discoveries of the previous day, Harris's whistle, his letters, the relics of the lost battalion, had left them both shaken and determined to dig deeper, both figuratively and their research pointed to an extensive network of tunnels dug beneath this sector, a subterranean maze of communication lines, supply routes, and emergency shelters. "Look at these maps," Marcus said, spreading several folded documents across the hood of their field truck. The faded drawings, annotated with frantic handwriting, showed lines zigzagging beneath the surface like veins. "This whole area is riddled with tunnels. If Harris's men fell here, there's a good chance some of these tunnels collapsed with them inside." Eleanor studied the maps with narrowed eyes. "We've seen trench systems, but tunnels? That's something else entirely. It's like uncovering a city beneath a city. Only this one's made of mud and death." They spent the morning scanning the ground with radar. The readings confirmed their suspicions. Several anomalies beneath the surface suggested the remnants of old passageways. Eleanor walked slowly across the field, following the faint dips in the terrain that hinted at collapsed tunnels. "There's something here," she murmured. "Oid benethis?" "There's something here," she murmured. A void beneath us. Marcus glanced up from the monitor. "I see it too. About 3 meters down. Could be risky if we dig. The ground might cave." Eleanor tightened her gloves and gave him a determined look. "Then we'll have to dig carefully. Those men down there deserve to be found." By midday, they had opened a small excavation site at the suspected tunnel entrance. Using shovels and trowels, they peeled away the layers of earth, uncovering timber planks and rusted metal supports. As they dug deeper, the smell of damp soil intensified, mixed with a faint metallic tang that made Eleanor's stomach churn. Finally, the shape of a tunnel mouth appeared, a dark, yawning hole braced with splintered wooden beams. Eleanor crouched at its edge, shining her flashlight into the darkness. A cold, stagnant air wafted out, carrying with it the faint scent of mildew and something older, a smell that spoke of decay and abandonment. "We'll need the respirators again," she said, pulling hers from her pack. Marcus hesitated. "Are you sure about this? These tunnels could be unstable. One wrong step and—" "I'm sure," Eleanor interrupted firmly. "If we don't go in, no one ever will." They descended slowly, the tunnel sloping downward into a world of shadows. The walls were lined with rotted timbers, many splintered and broken. Water dripped from the ceiling in irregular patterns, creating puddles on the uneven ground. Eleanor's flashlight beam danced over rusted relics, a bent spade, a collapsed ration tin, and the remains of wooden crates marked with faded German and British stamps. This tunnel had seen both sides of the war. This was a communication trench, Marcus whispered, his voice muffled by the respirator. They probably used it to move supplies or men under the cover of the battlefield. Eleanor stopped suddenly, crouching to pick up an object half buried in the mud. It was a German soldier's bayonet, still sharp despite its years underground. Nearby, she saw the skeletal remains of what once might have been a pair of boots, leather fragments fused to the soil. The deeper they went, the narrower the passage became. The air grew heavier, thick with the weight of history and silence. Eleanor's flashlight caught something glimmering on the ground. She knelt and uncovered a brass, lighter engraved with initials E.H. "Edward Harris," she whispered. "This was his." Marcus crouched beside her, his breath catching. Harris's men must have taken shelter here during the charge. If the tunnel collapsed while they were inside, duh. Eleanor didn't finish his sentence. She didn't have to. The weight of the truth pressed down on them like the earth overhead. The tunnel groaned again, louder this time, and a sharp crack echoed from the ceiling. Marcus grabbed Eleanor's arm. "We're leaving." Now clutching Harris's satchel, Eleanor followed Marcus as they scrambled back toward the entrance. The passage behind them shuddered, a section of timber collapsing in a cloud of dust. They barely made it out, tumbling into the open air just as part of the tunnel caved in with a low, resonant thud. Eleanor lay on her back, panting, the satchel clutched to her chest. "We almost didn't make it," she said, her voice trembling. Marcus sat beside her, his face pale but relieved. "You're insane," he muttered, "but that diary, that could be the key to everything." As the sun began to set, Eleanor sat by the excavation site, carefully opening Harris's diary. The first entry she read sent a chill down her spine, Sarand. "If this tunnel becomes our grave, may these words tell the world who we were. We fought not for glory, but for each other." Eleanor closed the diary gently, her heart heavy. Harris's voice, preserved through ink and time, felt as alive as any ghost. The farmhouse kitchen table was once again buried under relics, notebooks, and tools. But this time, all attention was on the battered leather diary, recovered from the collapsing tunnel. Eleanor sat with the diary open in front of her, a cup of untouched coffee cooling at her side. The pages were worn, their edges frayed and stained, but the ink, though faded, told the story of Captain Edward Harris in his own hand. Marcus leaned over her shoulder, his notebook ready, a pencil tucked behind his ear. "It's remarkable this survived at all," he murmured, gently brushing away a loose speck of dust from the paper. Harris must have written these words while knowing every moment could be his last. Eleanor read aloud, her voice quiet but steady. "Dear Aunt June, Jirsu, Ichenjobite Ishiti. The tunnels are our last refuge. We can hear the artillery overhead, the ground trembling with each strike. My men are exhausted, but their spirits remain unbroken. I carry the weight of their lives on my shoulders. Marcus took notes, his expression tense. He sounds resolute, like he knew this was the end. Eleanor turned the page and frowned. The next entry was filled with strange markings, numbers, symbols, and cryptic letters scattered between sentences. It was not random. Marcus, look at this. This isn't just a diary entry. It's a code for hours. They pored over the cryptic section, comparing the symbols with maps and military codes from the period. Marcus scribbled furiously, muttering to himself. He must have been trying to hide something. Maybe the location of his men, or a supply cache, or something he didn't want falling into enemy hands. Eleanor traced a series of symbols on the page with her finger. Look here. These markings correspond to trench coordinates. And this, she pointed to a sequence of numbers. This could be distances between key points. Marcus's eyes lit with realization. It's a map, a hidden map embedded in the diary. By mid-afternoon, they had cracked part of the code, enough to sketch a rough map on a separate sheet of paper. It outlined an area beyond no man's land, near a wooded ridge that neither of them had explored. Yet, at the center of the map was a symbol Eleanor didn't recognize. A cross surrounded by a circle with the letters HQ, written faintly beside it. HQ, Marcus mused aloud. Headquarters? Or maybe Harris's own command post? If that's where he and his men made their final stand, there could be a trove of artifacts there. Maybe even bodies. Eleanor closed the diary with a quiet determination. Then that's where we go tomorrow. If Harris left this map for someone to find, we have to follow it. As dusk settled, Eleanor stepped outside for fresh air, the weight of the diary still heavy in her mind. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and crimson, the fields quiet except for the rustle of wind through the grass. She took a deep breath and froze. Across the field, standing near the orchard where they had first met Marie Lefebvre, was Captain Edward Harris. His spectral form glowed faintly in the dim light, his whistle hanging from his neck, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't move, but the message was clear: follow the map. Eleanor's heart pounded as she took a step forward. But before she could speak, Harris faded into the evening mist, like a shadow swallowed by twilight. That night, Eleanor barely slept. Her dreams were filled with images of tunnels, trenches, and Harris's battalion charging across no man's land. She heard their voices, shouting orders, crying out for help, and whispering final words. The last voice she heard was Harris's, calm and steady. You're close, Dr. Hayes. Find us, and tell the world we were here. The next morning, Eleanor and Marcus set out for the ridge marked on the decoded map. The air was brisk, and the rising sun cast long shadows across the fields. They parked near a narrow dirt path that led into a dense grove of trees. The ground was uneven, with fragments of rusted barbed wire peeking out like skeletal remains. This place hasn't been touched in decades, Marcus said, adjusting his pack. If Harris's headquarters is here, it's buried deep. Eleanor nodded, holding the diary close to her chest. We'll find it. We have to. They followed the maps, measuring distances and cross-referencing with the landmarks Harris had mentioned in his coded entries. At the base of a ridge, they found what looked like the faint outline of a trench entrance, mostly filled with dirt and debris. This is it, Eleanor said, her voice firm. This is the place Harris marked. Marcus set up the radar scanner while Eleanor began clearing the entrance. The scanner's screen lit up with shadows and shapes beneath the surface, rectangular outlines that suggested crates, possibly personal belongings, or even a command table. We're definitely looking at a man-made structure, Marcus confirmed. This could be the command post. As they worked, Eleanor thought again of Harris's words. We fought not for glory, but for each other. Every dig, every artifact they uncovered, brought her closer to the men who had fought and died here. It was as if they were reaching through time, their voices urging her on. By late afternoon, they had uncovered the top of a wooden frame, the collapsed entrance to what could have been Harris's underground headquarters. The timbers were splintered, but the structure beneath seemed surprisingly intact. Eleanor wiped the sweat from her forehead and smiled faintly. We found it! The next morning, the sky was a pale sheet of gray, the air damp with the promise of rain. Eleanor and Marcus returned to the ridge with renewed determination. The previous day's excavation had revealed the wooden frame of a buried structure, likely the entrance to Captain Harris's command post. Today, their goal was simple but daunting: break through the collapsed entrance and uncover what lay inside. Marcus knelt near the entrance, his breath forming small clouds in the cool air. This could be dangerous, he said, running a hand over the cracked timbers. The wood's unstable. If the ceiling inside is compromised, we might be looking at a collapse. Eleanor adjusted her gloves and met his gaze. I know, but Harris left that map for a reason. This post might hold the answers to everything we've found so far. Maybe even the fate of his battalion. Marcus exhaled slowly, nodding. Then we proceed carefully, very carefully. They began by clearing more of the dirt and debris covering the entrance. With each shovelful of earth removed, the wooden structure became more defined. A heavy, reinforced doorway designed to withstand artillery fire. After an hour of digging, Eleanor pried open a gap large enough to slip through. The darkness inside was oppressive, the air stale and cold. Eleanor strapped on her headlamp, the beam of light cutting a narrow path into the void. I'll go first, she said. You follow me. Keep your weight distributed. Marcus tightened the straps on his pack and nodded. Lead the way. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint, metallic scent of rust and decay. The walls, lined with sandbags and rotting wood, bore faint scratches, as though someone had clawed at them long ago. Eleanor's flashlight swept across the cramped space, revealing a table covered in the detritus of war, corroded shell casings, a rusted lantern, and a scattering of papers that had somehow survived the decades. Marcus moved to the table, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted one of the papers. It's Harris's handwriting, he said, his voice hushed. These are orders, battle plans, supply notes. And look here, a casualty list. These are the names of his men. Eleanor's eyes scanned the list, her throat tightening. So many names, each one a life, a story cut short. At the far end of the room, Eleanor found a metal footlocker wedged against the wall. She knelt, brushing away the dirt and rust, and pried it open with a crowbar. The lid groaned, and inside lay a trove of personal artifacts, letters tied with twine, photographs of families smiling from another lifetime, and a small wooden box containing medals and insignias. One photograph, its edges curled with age, showed Captain Harris with his men. They stood shoulder to shoulder in the trench, mud on their faces, but smiles of camaraderie on their lips. Harris's eyes, even in the faded photograph, seemed to burn with the same determination Eleanor had glimpsed in his ghostly figure. He wanted us to see this, Eleanor murmured, to remember them as they were, not just as names on a list. Marcus found another notebook near the foot of the table, its pages brittle but legible. Listen to this, he said, reading aloud. We are surrounded. The Germans hold the high ground, and our supplies are nearly gone. I have sent for reinforcements, but I fear they will not arrive in time. If this is the end, let it be known that these men were the bravest I have ever known." Eleanor closed her eyes, her chest tightening. She could almost hear his voice as Marcus read the words, strong, resolute, but laced with the quiet acceptance of a soldier who knew his fate. As they catalogued the items, Eleanor noticed something scratched into the wooden wall beside the table. She leaned closer, brushing away a thin layer of grime to reveal the words carved into the wood. "Zevant, we held this ground with honor. Remember us." A chill ran down her spine. It was as if Harris himself had left a final plea, a message not just for her, but for anyone who would one day stand in this place. Suddenly, the air grew colder. Eleanor turned, her breath catching in her throat. At the far end of the room, Captain Edward Harris stood. His spectral form glowed faintly, his whistle gleaming in the dim light. He looked at Eleanor, his expression calm but resolute, and raised his hand in a silent salute. "Marcus," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "He's here." Marcus glanced around, but as always, saw nothing. "I don't see anything, Eleanor, but I believe you." Harris lowered his hand and gestured toward the table, where a small, folded letter lay half-buried beneath other papers. Eleanor reached for it, unfolding the brittle parchment. It was addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." She read aloud, pretty end of. "If you are reading this, we did not make it. We gave our lives for each other, and for those who will come after us. Do not let our story die here, forgotten in the earth." Eleanor's voice faltered as tears welled in her eyes. "I won't forget," she whispered. "I promise." They spent hours carefully photographing and cataloging every item in the command post, from Harris's battle orders to the personal letters of his men. By the time they emerged, the rain had begun to fall, pattering softly against the leaves. The world outside felt lighter, as though a weight had lifted. Back at the farmhouse, Eleanor laid out the letters and photographs on the table. She stared at Harris's letter for a long moment, then looked at Marcus. "This isn't just about artifacts anymore," she said. "It's about finishing their story. Harris wants us to uncover everything, every trench, every grave. We can't stop now." Marcus nodded, his expression solemn but resolved. "Then we won't stop." The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the world damp and quiet, as if the earth itself had taken a deep breath after the revelations of the command post. Eleanor and Marcus loaded their gear into the truck, the weight of Captain Harris's diary and artifacts still fresh in their minds. Today's mission would take them further along the map, to a place Harris had mentioned in passing, marked with a small red cross. A field hospital. Field hospitals were often set up just behind the lines, Marcus explained as they drove. They were crude, improvised, and overwhelmed. We might find medical supplies, maybe personal belongings of the wounded who passed through. Eleanor tightened her grip on the diary. "Or we might find the echoes of their suffering," she murmured. "Places like that, they don't just hold objects, they hold pain." The hospital site lay in a grassy clearing at the edge of a dense forest. At first glance, there was nothing to suggest its history, just a scattering of stones, and a patch of earth slightly darker than the surrounding field. But as Eleanor and Marcus began their survey, the shape of the past emerged. The faint outline of wooden frames, fragments of rusted bed frames, and shards of broken glass from what had once been medicine bottles. Eleanor crouched, brushing dirt from a rusted metal cross half buried in the soil. "This would have been a marker," she said softly, "perhaps for the medical tent, or maybe for those who didn't survive." Marcus scanning the area with the radar, nodded grimly. There's something under here. Rectangular shapes, shallow pits about a meter down. Could be supply boxes or graves. They began digging near one of the radar anomalies, their shovels cutting through the damp earth. After half an hour, Eleanor's blade struck wood. She knelt, clearing the soil to reveal a narrow box, its lid partially rotted. She opened it with care, revealing an array of medical instruments, rusted scalpels, bandage scissors, and syringes with cracked glass. A small tin of morphine ampules lay nestled among them, most shattered but a few still sealed. These tools saved lives, Marcus said, his voice low, and yet they must have seen so much death. Eleanor's gaze was fixed on a stained roll of cloth inside the box. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing blood-soaked bandages, now stiff and darkened with age. Some wounds were too much, she murmured, placing the bandages back with reverence. As they catalogued the find, Eleanor noticed a faint shape protruding from the earth. Nearby, she dug with her trowel, uncovering a battered wooden crate. Inside were personal items, a nurse's brooch, a small notebook filled with patient records, and a photograph of a young woman in a Red Cross uniform. Uniform. Marcus flipped through the notebook, translating the faded French handwriting. These are records of soldiers treated here. Look, Captain Harris's name appears. He must have sent some of his men here before the final charge. Eleanor's heart tightened. So even here, Harris's story weaves through everything. It's like he's guiding us from beyond. Suddenly, the wind shifted, and the air grew inexplicably colder. Eleanor looked up, her breath catching. A group of spectral figures stood at the far edge of the clearing. Nurses in pale uniforms, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Among them were soldiers lying on makeshift stretchers, their forms half-shrouded in ghostly mist. "Marcus?" Eleanor whispered. "They're here." He looked around but saw only empty space. "Eleanor, what do you see?" "The nurses. The wounded. They're watching us." Her voice trembled as the ghost of a nurse, her face smeared with the grime of endless work, stepped forward and pointed toward the remains of a tent frame. "Hey." Eleanor followed the silent gesture and began to dig at the spot. Beneath the soil, she uncovered a tin box sealed with a rusted clasp. Inside was a stack of letters, each stained and torn, but still legible. One was addressed to Mother, from your son, Arthur. She read aloud, "Prudence, Mother, I don't know if I will survive this. The nurses here are angels, but the pain is unbearable. If I do not return, tell Mary I loved her. Tell her I thought of her every night." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she folded the letter back into the box. "These men died without their words ever reaching home," she whispered. "But now someone will hear them. Someone will hear Sri here." For by late afternoon, they had unearthed more artifacts, shattered medicine bottles, fragments of stretchers, and a brass nameplate engraved with the words Field Hospital, Xiuqi. The nameplate, though worn, seemed to shimmer faintly in the dying light, as if acknowledging their work. Eleanor paused, staring at the spectral nurse who still stood near the tree line. For a brief moment, their eyes met. The nurse raised her hand in a small, grateful gesture before fading into the mist. Back at the farmhouse, Eleanor spread the letters across the table, carefully drying and preserving them. "These stories," she said, her voice steady but heavy with emotion. "They're not just about battles. They're about the human cost, the fear, the love, the suffering. We have to make sure these voices are never forgotten." Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "We will. Every artifact, every letter, we'll document them all. Harris and his men, the nurses, the wounded. They'll live again through our work. Eleanor looked down at the nurse's brooch, holding it in her palm. I think she wanted me to find this, she said softly, to remember her and all the lives she tried to save. The morning after their discovery of the field hospital, Eleanor and Marcus set out toward the sector marked on Harris's coded map as S-Line. According to military archives, this was once a critical supply route that ferried food, ammunition, and medical aid to the front. But Harris's diary hinted at something darker, an ambush that decimated a convoy of soldiers, leaving the ground soaked with blood and iron. This route was vital, Marcus explained as they hiked through the forest path that had long since overgrown. If Harris's men were expecting supplies that never arrived, it might explain why they were so desperate in their final stand. Eleanor glanced around, scanning the landscape. Though the forest was alive with birdsong and the scent of wet leaves, a heavy silence hung beneath the surface. This place feels wrong, she murmured, like the earth remembers. After several hours of trekking, they reached a clearing where the remains of the supply line were faintly visible. A rutted path once carved by wagons, now filled with wildflowers. Marcus set up the radar scanner while Eleanor examined the ground, her gloved hands brushing aside leaves and twigs. She found the first relic almost immediately, a rusted horseshoe half buried in the soil, its nails still clinging stubbornly to the corroded iron. Beside it was a fragment of leather harness, stiff and dark with age. These are from the supply wagons, she said softly. They were here. Marcus's radar began to beep steadily. There's something large beneath us, he said, staring at the monitor. Metallic, about a meter down. Could be ammunition crates. Or something worse. They began to dig, working methodically. After an hour, Eleanor's shovel struck wood. Clearing the soil, she uncovered the corner of a shattered crate, its contents spilling out, dozens of rusted rifle cartridges, their brass casings dulled by time. Mixed among the ammunition were personal effects, a tin cup, a battered mess kit, and a fragment of fabric from a soldier's coat. Eleanor held up the fabric, its once dark blue now faded to gray. This belonged to one of Harris's men, she murmured. Maybe one of the couriers guarding the supply line. Marcus's face grew somber as he examined the site. There was fighting here. You can tell by how the crates are scattered. This wasn't an orderly retreat. It was chaos. Eleanor moved a few feet from the dig site and noticed something protruding from the ground. The skeletal frame of a wagon wheel, its spokes warped and splintered. Nearby, the rusted remains of a rifle jutted from the earth like a broken spear. She knelt, tracing the weapon's shape with her fingers. This rifle... It was dropped mid-fight. Whoever held it didn't get far. Suddenly, the wind stilled. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor straightened, her senses prickling, and then she saw them, ghostly figures emerging from the tree line, half transparent and pale in the morning light. Soldiers in tattered uniforms, their faces drawn with fear and pain. In the midst of them was a young courier, no older than 20, clutching a satchel to his chest. Marcus, Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. They're here! The spectral courier locked eyes with her. His lips moved silently, forming words she couldn't quite hear. Then he pointed, not at the dig site, but a patch of earth about 20 paces away. Eleanor followed his gaze, her breath quickening. What is it? Marcus asked, confused by her sudden focus. Over there, she said, grabbing her trowel. There's something we're meant to find, Marcus didn't argue. Together, they dug where the courier had indicated. Within minutes, Eleanor's trowel struck a metal box, smaller and heavier than the supply crates. She pried it open, revealing its contents, a collection of sealed letters, their edges singed as though caught in fire, and a small silver pocket watch. The inscription on the watch's back read, "Tren to my son, Frederick. Come home safe." "Mother," Eleanor's throat tightened. "This belonged to the courier," she whispered. "His family never knew what happened to him." As she held the watch, the vision of the courier grew sharper. He seemed to nod at her, his expression one of relief. And then, as if satisfied, he dissolved into mist. Eleanor felt tears sting her eyes. "He just wanted someone to find him," she said softly. Marcus placed a hand on her shoulder. "And you did. They all just want to be remembered." By late afternoon, they had uncovered several more relics, rusted bayonets, bent mess tins, and the broken remains of a wagon axle. The scene they pieced together was grim. A supply convoy ambushed by enemy fire. The survivors cut down before they could retreat. Eleanor carefully catalogued each item, her hands shaking slightly as she placed the letters into protective sleeves. "This was a massacre," Marcus said quietly, looking at the spread of artifacts. "These men never stood a chance." Eleanor glanced down at the pocket watch, its silver surface catching the fading light. "But we found them," she said, "and now they'll be remembered." Tro. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of unseen eyes watching her. She turned toward the forest and, for a moment, thought she saw Harris standing there with the spectral courier, both of them nodding in approval before fading into the twilight. The next morning dawned with an uneasy stillness. A light fog clung to the rolling hills as Eleanor and Marcus followed the path, indicated on Harris's coded map, a winding trail leading to a ridge overlooking the battlefield. According to the diary, this ridge once held a heavy artillery position, a place that had rained destruction across no man's land and beyond. Marcus walked a few steps ahead, his trench coat brushing against the tall grass. "Artillery was the deadliest weapon of the war," he said. "Over half the casualties on the Western Front came from shelling. The guns didn't just tear up the land. They shattered the men who heard them day and night." Eleanor's gaze lingered on the distant horizon, her boots crunching softly against the dew-covered earth. "Harris wrote about this place," she said, holding the diary. "He called it when the voice of hell itself. I think we're going to see why." 2. Ration. They arrived at the ridge just as the sun began to burn through the fog. The ground here was scarred with the remnants of trenches, craters, and scattered debris, a desolate reminder of the battles that once raged. Marcus set up the radar equipment, scanning the slope. "I'm picking up large metallic signatures," he said. "Likely artillery pieces, buried or collapsed after the war." Eleanor moved closer to one of the craters, kneeling as her fingers brushed against a twisted shard of metal. She pulled it free. A fragment of an artillery shell, its edges jagged and sharp. Holding it up, she felt its weight. "This tore through the air like thunder," she whispered. "Imagine being in the trenches, knowing something like this was coming down on you." Marcus joined her, crouching beside the crater. "You wouldn't hear the one that killed you," he said quietly. "The shell that took your life would be the one you never saw coming." The first, their excavation, began near the radar's largest signal. After clearing away layers of soil, they uncovered the massive, rusted barrel of a howitzer, half buried and frozen in time. Its wheels were shattered, the iron spokes twisted, but the sheer size of it was awe-inspiring. Eleanor stood back, staring at the weapon. "This was a monster," she said. a weapon designed to break both land and spirit. Beside the howitzer, they found shell casings, each one as large as Eleanor's forearm. The shells were pitted with rust, their brass casings dulled but still hinting at their destructive power. Marcus picked up a shell casing, examining the markings stamped into the metal. "German manufacture," he said. "Probably Ichenjubite Isaleup. This position could have been responsible for shelling Harris's battalion before their final charge." Eleanor crouched to inspect the ground around the gun. Among the mud and rusted fragments, she found a torn leather pouch containing artillery range cards, handwritten notes on distances, angles, and coordinates. "This was a gunner's log," she murmured. "Every shot carefully planned, every shell meant to find its mark as they worked." A sudden gust of wind swept across the ridge, carrying with it a faint, rhythmic sound, like the thud of distant artillery. Eleanor froze, glancing at Marcus. "Did you hear that?" Marcus tilted his head, listening. I think so," he admitted, his voice uncertain. "It sounded like gunfire," Eleanor finished, "or echoes of it." She turned back toward the howitzer, and her heart skipped a beat. Standing beside the rusted gun was a spectral figure, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in the ghostly outline of a German artillery uniform. His hands rested on the invisible crank of the weapon, his face grim and resolute. "Wilhelm Bauer," Eleanor whispered. She recognized him instantly, the spectral German sergeant they had encountered before. He looked directly at her, his dark eyes filled with something between pride and sorrow. Then, slowly, he pointed toward the ground near the base of the howitzer. Eleanor moved toward the spot, kneeling. Her hands brushed aside soil and leaves until she uncovered a small wooden box, heavily rotted but still intact. Inside was a collection of personal items, a steel lighter engraved with the initials WB, a photograph of Bauer with his gun crew, and a small, tarnished cross. Marcus looked over her shoulder, his voice hushed. "This is Bauer's. His men must have buried these here after he fell." Eleanor's voice trembled. "He's asking us to remember them too. Not just Harris's men, but the other side as well." By mid-afternoon, they had catalogued all the artifacts, shell casings, range cards, and Bauer's personal box. Eleanor felt a strange kinship with the spectral figure, as though the stories of Harris and Bauer were intertwined, the same tragedy. As they packed their equipment, Eleanor glanced back at the howitzer. Bauer was still there, watching. He raised his hand in a soldier's salute, his ghostly outline fading as the sun dipped behind the clouds. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Eleanor laid Bauer's photograph on the table next to Harris's. Two men, once enemies, now side by side. "They fought for different flags," she said, softly, "but they both fought for the same thing: survival and the hope of seeing home again." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it? We came here looking for battlefields, but what we're finding is humanity." Enna touched Bauer's cross, her fingers lingering on the cool metal. "I think they want us to see that." The morning air was heavy with mist as Eleanor and Marcus followed the ridgeline, tracing the path of the old artillery network. Their discovery of Bauer's howitzer the previous day had left them both thoughtful and quiet, as though they were carrying not just artifacts, but the echoes of the men who once commanded those guns. Harris's diary mentioned communication lines, fragile lifelines of copper wire that carried orders, PSS and Brobus, and Beris, desperate pleas, and final words during the chaos of battle. Trench telephones were vital, Marcus explained as they hiked. If these lines broke, the front line was cut off from command. Harris wrote about trying to call for reinforcements in his final hours, but no one ever answered. Eleanor, carrying a coil of new rope over her shoulder, tightened her grip on the diary. If we find those lines, maybe we'll uncover the messages that were never heard, the voices trapped between the static and the gunfire. The ground they walked on was uneven, riddled with depressions that hinted at buried trenches. Marcus swept the area with the radar scanner, the hum of the device breaking the silence. "I'm picking up a narrow metallic line, about a meter deep," he said, pointing to the scanner's display. "It stretches for at least 50 meters. It has to be the telephone cable." Eleanor dropped to her knees, brushing away the topsoil. Her trowel struck something thin and rigid. She cleared it further, revealing the corroded copper line, still snaking through the earth like a vein of forgotten lifeblood. "Found it," she said softly. This line carried the last calls of men who knew they might never speak again. They followed the line, carefully excavating sections as they went. About 20 meters from their starting point, Eleanor uncovered something unexpected, a wooden junction box, its sides blackened by fire. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside were twisted wires, remnants of a battery pack, and a small handwritten log book sealed in waxed cloth. Marcus peered over her shoulder. "A switchboard log," he said, excitement flickering in his voice. This would have recorded incoming and outgoing calls. Sister 2's. If anything survived, it could tell us who was calling for help during the last bombardments. Eleanor opened the log. The ink was faint, but legible. One entry stood out, dated just hours before Harris's battalion disappeared. Rillian, Captain Harris, requesting immediate artillery support. Line unstable. Enemy counterattacks increasing. Last contact at Shu Si Chi. Eleanor's eyes filled with tears as she read the time aloud. This is the exact moment his watch stopped. "The pocket watch we found with the courier." Marcus exhaled slowly. He tried until the very end to save his men. And this line, it died with them. Continuing along the trench line, they uncovered more remnants, shattered telephone handsets, a crumpled headset, and a wooden reel that once held hundreds of meters of wire. Eleanor held one of the handsets in her gloved hand, imagining the frantic voices that once traveled through it. "Can you hear them?" she whispered. The fear in their voices, the hope that someone might respond. Marcus, crouching beside her, nodded solemnly. These weren't just tools. They were lifelines as the afternoon sun broke through the mist. Eleanor felt that familiar chill sweep over her. She looked up and saw them. Spectral figures crouched in the trench, speaking into phantom telephones, their faces pale and desperate. At the center of them stood Harris, his uniform torn, his whistle dangling from his neck. He looked directly at her, his expression grave. "Marcus," Eleanor said softly. "He's here again." Marcus looked around, seeing nothing but the scarred earth. "What's he doing?" "He's pointing," she said, her breath quickening. Harris raised a ghostly hand and gestured toward a patch of earth near the junction box. Eleanor dug quickly, guided by an almost instinctive pull. Soon her trowel struck something hard, a small metal case, corroded but sealed. She pried it open and found a collection of handwritten notes, urgent messages scribbled on field paper, some barely legible. The top note read, "Durant to Battalion HQ. We are holding, but cannot last much longer. The enemy is breaking through. Please respond. E. Harris." Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the final message in the stack pronged. "This may be my last transmission. To whoever finds this, we fought with honor. Do not let our story die." By the time they finished cataloging the site, the light was fading. They carefully collected the logbook, the notes, and the handset, storing them in protective cases. Standing at the edge of the trench, Eleanor looked once more toward the place where Harris had stood. He was still there, his pale form glowing softly in the twilight. He raised his hand in a final salute, and then, slowly, he faded into the mist. Eleanor swallowed hard. "He knows we've heard him now," she said. His voice, it's finally being carried forward. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Eleanor spread the recovered messages across the table. She read them aloud in the soft glow of the lantern, her voice steady but filled with emotion. Marcus listened silently, scribbling translations and notes. "These words," she said, closing the final letter, "are the heartbeat of this battlefield. They remind us that behind every trench, every artifact, there were voices, human voices, calling out across the void." Marcus placed a hand on the handset they had recovered. And now, after 100 years, someone is finally answering. The morning mist still clung to the trees as Eleanor and Dot. Marcus followed the old communication line, deeper into the forest. The discovery of Harris's final calls weighed heavily on both of them. No, the copper wire seemed to lead them towards something even darker. The heart of the command structure that once controlled this sector of the Western Front. According to the faded war records Marcus had studied, there had been a large command bunker hidden under a ridge, the nerve center for both strategies and desperate final decisions. Eleanor ran her hand along the faint depression in the ground, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. "This wire must have led straight to the officer's bunker," she murmured. "If Harris's messages never made it through, maybe this place holds the answer." Marcus adjusted his glasses, scanning the area with the radar unit. "I'm picking up something big underground. It's about 5 meters wide and rectangular. Definitely man-made. The walls might still be intact if we're lucky." "Lucky," Eleanor repeated softly, looking toward the ridge. "I'm not sure. Your lucky applies to a place where men made their last stand." They spent the morning clearing away debris from what appeared to be a collapsed entrance. Wooden planks, rusted sheet metal, and thick roots had sealed the doorway shut for over a century. Eleanor, sweat dripping down her temple, pried at the timbers with a crowbar while Marcus shoveled the earth away. Finally, with a loud creak, a gap opened. A rush of stale, cold air greeted them, carrying with it the scent of rust and time. And something else, something faintly bitter, that made Eleanor's skin crawl. "We'll need our headlamps," Marcus said, pulling his from his pack, "and respirators. This air hasn't been breathed since the war." Inside, the bunker was like a tomb. The beam of Eleanor's headlamp revealed rusted bunks lined against the walls, the skeletal remains of wooden chairs, and a desk covered in papers that had crumbled to fragments. The walls, reinforced with sandbags and steel plates, were pitted and scarred, evidence of bombardment and fire. "This was where the officers coordinated their defenses," Marcus said. His voice hushed as though afraid to disturb the silence. "Where they made impossible choices, and probably where they waited for orders that never came." Eleanor stepped forward, her boots crunching on debris. She brushed aside dirt and found a rusted field telephone, still mounted on the wall, its cord dangling like a lifeline that had been severed. "Harris's calls might have ended here," she said softly. "This phone might have been silent while he and his men fought for their lives." On the desk, Eleanor discovered a leather-bound notebook, its cover warped, but the pages inside surprisingly intact. She opened it carefully. "This is an officer's log," she said. "Listen to this entry. July Ichen Jubite Ishati. The line to Captain Harris is down. We've sent runners, but none have returned. The shelling is relentless. I fear we cannot hold the ridge." Marcus looked over her shoulder. "That matches Harris's final messages. They were cut off, literally left to die in the trenches." As they explored further into the bunker, Eleanor's flashlight beam landed on something that made her stop cold.
What?
On the far wall, scrawled in chalk, were the words Breiderk. We did not abandon them. We could not reach them. Forgive us. She ran her fingers lightly over the faint writing, her throat tight. This was their confession, she said. Their last message to the men they couldn't save. Marcus swallowed hard, his usually analytical expression softening. This place isn't just history. It's guilt etched into stone. In a corner of the bunker, Eleanor found a small wooden chest, locked with a rusted clasp. She pried it open and gasped. And inside were personal items, an officer's pistol, a pair of reading glasses, and a stack of letters written in haste. She unfolded the top letter and read aloud. Sidiance, to my wife, Margaret. If this letter reaches you, know that I did everything I could. Tell our son I fought until my last breath. I can hear the shells now. I am sorry I won't be there to see him grow. Her voice cracked as she folded the letter back. They were so human, she whispered. So vulnerable. The air grew colder and Eleanor felt that familiar prickle on her skin. She turned, and there they were. 3 spectral figures stood at the far end of the bunker, officers in mud-stained uniforms, their faces pale and solemn. At the center was a tall man with sharp features and a captain's insignia. Harris himself. Peep Birigens and Preeps Eden Dins and Pave Shinstrully. Marcus, Eleanor said quietly, her voice trembling.
He's here! Harris is here!
Marcus looked around but saw only shadows. What is he doing? He's watching us. He knows we found this place. Harris raised his hand slowly, pointing toward the desk. Eleanor followed his gesture and noticed a small, hidden compartment beneath the surface. She pried it open and found a folded piece of parchment. Its edges singed. The message read Paretjound. To whoever finds this, tell our story. Do not let us vanish into the earth. We were here. We fought. We mattered. Eleanor clutched the note to her chest, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. I promise, she whispered to the ghostly figures. I'll tell the world. By the time they emerged from the bunker, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows over the ridge. The silence of the forest felt almost reverent, as though the spirits of the officers had finally found peace. That evening, Eleanor and Marcus spread the letters, photographs, and logbooks across the farmhouse table. Every artifact we've found, Marcus said softly, isn't just a piece of history. It's a piece of someone's soul. Eleanor nodded, staring at the chalk words she had photographed from the bunker wall. We'll make sure they're remembered. Every last one of them. The sky was an unbroken expanse of gray when Eleanor and Marcus set out toward the coordinates indicated on the final pages of Harris's diary. The entries spoke of a nighttime trench raid, one of the most dangerous and desperate operations in the war. Conducted under cover of darkness, these raids were designed to capture enemy intelligence, sabotage defenses, or disrupt supply lines. But, as Harris had noted in his terse handwriting, the cost of the night was blood. According to Harris's notes, this is where one of his last raids took place, Marcus said, pointing to a slight rise in the landscape. He wrote about losing men here, men who volunteered for something they knew they might not return from. Eleanor tightened the strap on her satchel and looked out over the field. The ground was uneven, dotted with faint mounds and depressions. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of the wind. The night raid, she murmured, the kind of mission where every step could be your last. They began their survey, using radar to map what lay beneath the soil. Marcus's brow furrowed as he studied the readings. I'm seeing clustered metal signatures, he said. Not just scattered debris. These are grouped. Helmets, maybe weapons, all in one spot. Eleanor crouched, brushing away the surface soil. Her trowel hit something solid, the rim of a British Brodie helmet. She dug it out carefully, turning it over in her hands. The helmet was dented, and faint traces of mud still clung to its surface, as though the soldier had just removed it. "There's more here," she said, pointing to a spot nearby. Within an hour, they had uncovered a collection of relics, several helmets, fragments of rifles, and personal items, a pipe, a pocket Bible, and a pair of small binoculars. Each object spoke of a man who had gone out into the night, not knowing if he would return. Marcus picked up the Bible, its leather cover cracked with age. "This was carried into battle," he said quietly. "Someone must have held onto this for courage. Maybe they read it under the dim light of a trench candle before stepping into the darkness." Eleanor nodded, her fingers brushing over a discarded bayonet. "These men were more than soldiers," she said softly. "They were sons, fathers, brothers. Every object here tells a story of fear and bravery." As they continued to dig, Eleanor found something unusual, a small cloth pouch. She opened it to reveal a handful of silver coins, each engraved with the date Ichen Jubite Ishalup. "These must have been carried for luck," she said, "or maybe to pay for a drink if they survived the raid." Suddenly the wind dropped and the air grew unnervingly still. Eleanor froze, sensing the now familiar presence. She looked up and saw them, a spectral group of soldiers moving across the field, their forms faint but unmistakable. They crouched low, bayonets fixed, their faces tense with anticipation. Leading them was a man with sharp features and steady eyes. "Captain Harris." "Harris is here," Eleanor whispered. "He's leading them." Marcus turned, but as always, he saw nothing. "What is he doing? He's showing us how it happened," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "The night raid. They're moving through the dark. I can almost hear their footsteps." As she watched, the ghostly Harris raised his hand, signaling the charge. The soldiers surged forward, their forms flickering like candlelight. Then, as quickly as they had appeared, they vanished into the mist. Shaken, Eleanor returned to the dig site. Guided by instinct, she dug where Harris's spectral form had crouched moments before. Her trowel struck wood, a shallow, weathered box buried just below the surface. She pried it open and found a collection of personal letters and a small notebook. The top letter read "Beardy out." "To my beloved Sarah, if I don't return, know that I fought with courage, and that every step I took in the dark, I thought of you." Eleanor's throat tightened as she read the words aloud. Marcus listened silently, his hand resting on the edge of the box. Among the items in the box was something extraordinary. A silver trench watch, its hands frozen at Sursan, the time, perhaps, when the raid had begun. On the back was an engraving written "To my son, with love, Father." Eleanor turned the watch over in her palm, feeling the cold metal against her skin. "He carried this into the night," she whispered. It was probably the last thing he saw before stepping into the darkness. By late afternoon, they had catalogued the entire site. The relics told the story of a small group of men who had ventured beyond their trench lines, under cover of darkness, hoping to turn the tide of battle. Most never returned. As they packed the items, Eleanor looked once more at the field. In the fading light, she thought she saw Harris standing there, his whistle glinting faintly. He gave her a solemn nod, a gesture of both gratitude and farewell, before vanishing once more. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Eleanor laid the trench watch beside the Bible and the letters. She traced her fingers over the engraving, her voice quiet but firm. "Every artifact we find is like a voice calling out to be remembered. These men didn't die nameless. Not if we can help it." Marcus nodded, his expression thoughtful. "So, we followed Harris's journey from his trenches to the command post, to this raid. I think we're getting close to the end of his story. Eleanor looked down at the silver watch, its hands frozen in time. The end, she murmured, but not forgotten. The final day on the Western Front began with an eerie calm. The mist clung low to the ground, weaving through the broken remnants of trenches and craters like a shroud. Eleanor stood at the edge of the field, and Harris's diary in one hand and the silver trench watch in the other. The past few weeks had been a relentless journey through history, uncovering not just artifacts, but the raw emotions of the men who had fought and died here. Today, she and Marcus would tie the threads together. Harris's battalion, Bauer's gun crew, the nurses, the couriers, every soul they had unearthed in both history and spirit. Marcus joined her, adjusting his glasses as he looked out across the land. "It's strange, isn't it?" he said. "We've found so many stories, yet I feel like the battlefield still has more to tell." Eleanor nodded. "It does, but I think we've pieced together the heart of it. Harris, Bauer, the wounded. They were all connected by this ground, by what happened here." They began their final survey at the ridge where Harris's command post once stood. Eleanor laid out the artifacts they had collected: Harris's whistle, Bauer's cross, the nurse's brooch, the courier's pocket watch, and the letters from the trench raid. Each item was carefully placed on a canvas cloth, forming a mosaic of memories. "This is more than history," Eleanor said softly. "It's a testament to humanity, to bravery, fear, love, and sacrifice. Every item here belonged to someone who lived and dreamed." Marcus crouched beside her, opening Harris's diary to the last entry, Sharidnau. "If these words survive, let them tell the world that we fought not for the glory of war, but for each other. Do not let this ground forget our names." The wind shifted suddenly, carrying with it a sound that sent chills up Eleanor's spine. Faint voices, like whispers on the breeze. She turned and saw them. The mist rolled back slightly, revealing a spectral scene unlike any she had witnessed before. Soldiers from both sides stood together, British and German, French and Irish, their ghostly forms united. At the center stood Harris and Bauer, side by side. "Marcus," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "They're all here." Marcus glanced around but saw only the mist. "Describe it to me," he said gently. "They're standing together," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "Harris, Bauer, the nurses, the courier. They're watching us, Marcus. I think they're waiting for something." Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped forward, holding Harris's diary in both hands. "We found your stories," she said, her voice firm yet reverent. "We've seen the trenches, the bunkers, the hospitals, and the fields where you fought and fell. You are not forgotten." As she spoke, the spectral figures seemed to grow brighter, their outlines sharper against the mist. Harris raised his hand in a salute, his gaze locked on Eleanor's. Beside him, Bauer nodded solemnly, his ghostly cross glinting faintly in the dim light. Marcus, though unable to see them, felt the air change, a heaviness lifting, replaced by a quiet warmth. "It's like they heard you," he said softly. Eleanor knelt, placing Harris's diary on the ground, along with Bauer's cross and the other artifacts. "These belong to you," she whispered. "We'll tell the world who you were. Your names will live on." For a moment, silence fell. Then, slowly, the spectral figures began to fade, dissolving into the mist like smoke carried on the wind. The last to vanish were Harris and Bauer, both of them standing tall, their faces calm and at peace. Harris gave a final nod, as though to say, "Thank you." The rest of the day was spent in quiet reflection. Eleanor and Marcus documented the final artifacts, photographing them and taking detailed notes. There was no rush. They both felt that the work they had done had transcended archaeology. They had bridged a century of silence. As dusk approached, Eleanor sat on the ridge, watching the sun sink behind the distant hills. "Do you think they're at peace now?" she asked. Marcus, sitting beside her, nodded. "I think they are. And I think you gave that to them." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Not just me. Us. This whole journey, it wasn't just about finding objects. It was about finding them. And we did. That evening, back at the farmhouse, they laid all the artifacts on the table one final time. The whistle, the cross, the brooch, the watch, the letters. Each one a voice speaking from beyond the grave. Eleanor ran her hand over the collection and whispered, "You're home now." Marcus looked at her with quiet admiration. "What will you do when we leave here?" he asked. Eleanor thought for a moment, then smiled. "I'll write their story. Every letter, every diary, every name we found will be part of something bigger. I want the world to remember this place, to remember them." Later that night, as Eleanor drifted to sleep, she dreamed of the battlefield one last time. But this time, it was not filled with gunfire or screams. The fields were green and bright, the sky clear, and the soldiers walked together in peace, their faces calm. At the center, Harris and Bauer stood side by side, watching her with quiet pride.